Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Track Records with your hosts, Kenny and Barry. And this is completely unscripted. Even we don't know where the conversation is going to go. So if there's occasional hem and haw or searching for memories or clearing our throats, please bear with us. You're just along for the ride. And Barry, as we were talking about last week, we're talking about bands or artists who have never released a bad album, in our opinion. We clarified it as they had to have released at least 6 albums, and we're not including greatest hits, live albums, rarities, B-sides, etc. And before we pick up where we left off, which was we were talking about Funkadelic, we're about to launch into talk about Funkadelic. I did want to also include 2 other bands which we didn't mention, and those are the old 97s and the replacements. And I know you're not that familiar with old 97s, and they're about to release their 14th album. That's quite a lot of albums without releasing a bad one, in my opinion. The one I'd particularly recommend would be Satellite Rides. And that is when they really hit their groove. So that album, the next like 2 or 3 albums after that are really their best work. And then as far as the replacements go, obviously their sound was one way early and then it changed late. I like them all the way through. What's your opinion on them?
So I guess I would include the replacements on that list. Their last 2 records, Don't Tell a Soul and All Shook Down, I don't think are great. In fact, I think they're downright mediocre, but I don't think you can categorize those as total stinkers like some of the other stinkers that put
And
out
that
by bands like the Stones that we talked about earlier. So I guess I'd have to agree with you there.
Okay. And then also, we talked about Husker Du, and you'd mentioned, well, check out their early albums because they're real punk albums. Now, Land Speed was a live album, so we're not including that. But I did go ahead and listen to Everything Falls Apart and Zen Arcade again. And, they're certainly not like their later albums, but they're real hints of what they're about to be. And they're uneven, and the production is kind of weak at times, especially with Everything Falls Apart. But I don't think they're bad albums by any means.
Um, Yeah, I don't necessarily think they're bad albums, especially Zen Arcade. Zen Arcade, I think, is a classic of the genre. It was Land Speed Record and Metal Circus,
Okay,
and Everything Falls Apart.
and
Those
metal
were the 3 that
metal
I was talking about.
and as I said, Landspeed was a live album, so we're not including that. And Metal Circus was an EP, so I wasn't including that either.
Okay, I didn't know that was an EP.
Yeah.
I think it has about 15 songs on it, but they're probably a
They're
minute
like
long
I was
each.
gonna say, yeah.
Um, so the old 97s, yeah, as you mentioned, I don't know them at all. Would they fall into the category, if you have to put them in a category of roots rock or
Alt,
Americana,
alt country. Yeah.
alt country? Yeah.
Yeah.
I, I I look at all that stuff as kind of the same sort of thing. Um, and I don't mean that in a bad way.
Right.
Just, that's just how I would categorize it. So yeah, I don't know those guys at all. Are they they're not a Boston band, are they?
No, they're from Dallas actually originally. And Rhett Miller, the lead singer and songwriter, I really like all of his solo albums as well. They're not as good as the old 97s records, but they are quite good in their own right. And he tours solo as well as with a band. As I said, if you're going to check out an album to start with, Satellite Rides is the album I would recommend. It's quite good, but again, I like all of their albums. But really, it's starting there, like the later end of their career, where they really again started to really find their voice and find their style.
Hmm.
So, and then going back to Funkadelic, and you had talked about their first couple albums in particular, "Free Your Mind" and "Your Ass Will Follow" and "Maggotbrain," and so I did go ahead and listen to those as well. And Maggotbrain in particular, I liked quite a bit. The guitar work on that is just sensational and really reminded me a lot of Jeff Beck in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that the title track Maggot Brain
Yeah,
is is somewhat legendary, and Ediehazel was the guitarist
right.
back then for
Yeah,
Funkadelic, and heavily influenced by Hendrix, and a lot of people thought he was going to be the successor to the throne once Hendrix died. But um, yeah, just talking about Funkadelic or some of these other bands, it does seem like it's pretty much almost impossible to do to stay together for decades and never put out a bad record. I think Funkadelic, much like some of the other bands we talked about, Zeppelin or the Jam, benefited by not being together for decades, maybe 10 years. So they didn't have as many records to put out without putting out a stinker. And their first few records in particular are somewhat unique in that they're rock records, but they're also there's a heavy funk element, coincidentally, with a band named Funkadelic. So they're really great combinations of rock and funk, and they're really raw sounding, in my opinion. And that goes for about their first five, and then they so the two you mentioned, there's a self-titled one, America Eats Its Young, which came out 72-ish, Cosmic Slop. All of those records have that they're really rough sounding and somewhat dark sounding. So if you can imagine, funk done in a really rock way, it's the
Right.
only
No,
way I can really describe them. And as you saw from listening to those two.
and what's interesting also is that they started out as the Parliaments, and they were like a doo-wop soul group, and George Clinton was even signed to Motown. And
Yes, yes, that's right. He yeah, he had an interesting path to get to Funkadelic and Parliament. Um, and what I was gonna say is the later records blurred the line. The later Funkadelic records blurred the line more between Funkadelic and Parliament, whereas, as I think most people know, or maybe not, they were collectives that George Clinton was the mastermind of. You had
right.
Parliament, you had Funkadelic, and they were going at the same time in the 70s up, through the 80s and longer. And they both had different groups of musicians. Funkadelic was always the harder edge, more rock oriented band, whereas Parliament was slicker and more funk and more dance music.
Right.
Um, but the lines started blurring around, I would say around 75, 76 with their records, Hardcore Jollies, and then Tales of Kid Funkadelic. They started sounding more like Parliament records to me. And while I like them still, they're not as good as their early, more rock oriented ones, in my opinion.
I thought maggotbrain was really outstanding. So
Yeah, I'm glad you liked
I was
it.
glad you pointed that out.
It's funny. And by the way, I think all of their records are back in print on vinyl, whereas for years, they were the original copies of them were highly sought after because there wasn't millions of them around. And when you would find one, it was usually somewhat thrashed because they were classic party records. So it's cool to see that all their records are back in print.
Has the
Um,
re-release of a lot of stuff on vinyl affected prices of originals on vinyl?
yeah, that's an interesting question. Because the jury's still out on that. And from what I see, it doesn't make a big difference one way or the other. Because on one hand, it's great that you could get all these super expensive records again. You could buy brand new copies of them, but there's still this huge market of record collectors who don't care about the reissues, so they will still continue
That's
to
what I was
pay the
wondering.
big prices for the originals. So I guess to answer your question is it's helped people who want those records
Right.
without spending an arm and a leg on them. But in the collector circles, original pressings still do
Got it.
bring home the bacon, so to speak. And for particular bands, original pressings of records, Funkadelic being one of those, they command very high prices
Got
to
it.
people who can afford such things. But anyway, yeah. So I think Funkadelic firmly falls into this category of never putting out a shitty record. um,
And
I
what do
have
you
a
think of
bunch.
something like One Nation Under a Groove?
Yeah, I like. That's when they became super dancey.
Yep.
And what that was, I think, their second to last record.
Yeah,
And
1990.
yeah, and it might as well be Parliament.
Yeah.
And that's fine, but and I like that stuff. But again, it's not my favorite of theirs, but you could not call it a crappy record.
Right. Sure.
And just to correct you on your dates, they broke Funkadelic stopped putting out records around 79. The record that came after One Nation Under a Groove, Uncle Jam Wants You. But anyway, they kept I think George Clinton would take them out on tour every once in a while with a rotating cast of characters.
Right.
There would be a few guys from the golden era, Funkadelic, then George Clinton, then a bunch of other dudes. The thread that holding them together was always George Clinton, though. But yeah, they stopped actively putting out records in the very late 70s, I think.
Got it. Okay.
Maybe early 80s. Yeah, actually, yeah. Anyway, that's minutia. There was one record after Uncle Jam, The Electric Spanking of War Babies, that came out in the early 80s.
And still not a bad album.
No,
Okay.
and I have all these, of course, because
Right.
I'm a huge fan.
Yeah.
And yeah, good dance music.
All right. So who else makes your list?
Okay. These are the ones I'm calling out now are still fall into the category of bands that, to my knowledge, you're pretty familiar with.
Okay.
Luna, the band Luna, who formed out of the ashes of Galaxy 500,
Which I like that band too.
Yeah, I know you're a fan of theirs as well. But Luna getting together in the whatever, I guess the early 90s, and you turned me on to them, in fact. Those many years ago. I don't think they've ever put out a bad record.
And how many records have they put out now?
I would guess
not a ton.
No, but it's certainly over 6.
Okay.
Probably 7 or 8.
I think I really have never heard a bad Luna album either. I would agree with that. It's just Penthouse is such a great album that for me, I got to say, it's so good that it at times it lessens my appreciation of the stuff that came after it, because I like that album so much. It's definitely one of my all-time favorite albums.
Do you know the one that came right after it, Pup Tent?
Yep, and I like Pup Tent. Is that also the one that has a cover of Donovan's Season of the Witch?
No.
Okay.
That's either on an EP or extra tracks on a CD or something. I don't think that's on one of their regular records, as far as I know. But they, their first run ended around 2004 when they broke up, but shockingly they got back together.
Who doesn't?
And I think 3 or 4 or 5 years ago they put out a record that was one of those covers records.
And we're not including those.
I guess not.
Because that's actually what I talked about Firewater before, like in all Firewater albums, except for I would actually point out their covers album I thought was not a good album. But I didn't include it because I figured we weren't including covers albums.
Yeah, I was just bringing it up because, just because they had gotten back together and they're still active. I think I told you I saw them, was it last year? Either last year or the year before, when I was still living in Seattle at a relatively small club, and still really good.
They're
really
great.
Good.
Though it's funny when you see them live because their fans are quite subdued, almost shoegazing. But the band itself is great, and I do like their covers. As a matter of fact, they cover a Dream Syndicate song. That's What You Always Say, which is my favorite Dream Syndicate song. And
From the days of Wine and Roses.
Yeah, which is really the only good Dream Syndicate album. What Medicine Show?
I think the Medicine Show is really good.
I think it's good. I think it's not a bad album by any means. It's good, but it's certainly not nearly as good as the first album. And everything after Medicine Show, you don't need to get.
What was I going to say? Oh, back to Luna. So you were talking about their liking their covers, and they do have at least a couple records out that are all covers. But when they played Seattle this last time, they did 2 shows at this club. And this club holds 400 people maybe. It was a place where my bands used to play, so that gives you an idea how
Yeah.
small it was. One night they did a greatest hits set. That's the show that I went to, and then the next night they did all covers.
That's
Which,
cool. I like that.
yeah, I didn't go to that one because I wanted to hear their songs.
Sure.
Songs that
That makes sense.
I would love
That's the
theirs.
sort of thing I would have gone to both. That's what I enjoy doing. But I remember the first time I saw Poor Dog Plundering, they ended by doing a cover of Suspicious Minds, and then they did Is That All There Is? And they just happened to be just randomly 2 of my favorite songs, and I was like, I couldn't believe those are the songs that they did as encores and closed with. So sometimes the right cover at the right time.
Um, all right, enough about Luna.
Yep.
Do you want me to give you some of the other ones on my list?
Yeah, please.
And again, for anyone listening, these are our picks for bands or artists who have never put out a crappy record. Minimum of 6 records released. Okay, this one will be up your alley. I think every ABBA record is really good,
Yes.
including the one that came out a year or 2 ago. I guess probably 3 years ago now, which sounds like classic ABBA to me.
And I've only heard a little bit of that, but I remember their last album before that, which was many years ago, and had sort of a mixed critical reception, but had a song on there called "The Visitors," which is actually one of my favorite ABBA songs, and I really like that.
That's
and
the title cut.
is that what that
Yeah.
was? Yeah. And so it was very cool. It was a little different for them. Still classic ABBA, but a little different. And I liked it a lot. And yeah, I'm a big ABBA fan, as you know. And unfortunately, I think most people on the planet just own ABBA Gold. You know,
Or yeah, or most people, or a lot of people anyway, consider ABBA a bit of a joke. Although that tide is changing.
well, no,
I
certainly
remember,
with Mamma Mia coming out and all that, so.
yeah, and any self-respecting rock fan despised ABBA during their heyday, back when they were still active and
Right.
very popular. I know I did. I never took them seriously until decades later, and I actually started listening to their records and really appreciating them.
And I actually got to see them in Boston. And I always tried not to do that. I tried not to, to get on my high horse about certain bands. If I didn't like a band, I don't like a band. And so there's a band, like, for example, I'm sure you love and Kim loves, which I loathe, which is Rush.
Yeah,
and so
they're on my list.
yeah.
Or
And
no,
so,
they're not. They're not. I'm
okay.
sorry, they're not.
Okay. But
They're on a
that,
different list related to this topic. We'll get to it.
okay. I'm looking
Hey,
forward
Luna.
to that. But yeah,
That is Luna,
that's
right?
Luna. Yep. And at my feet is Mojo, because they have to be with me because they want to learn about music, because they live in this household. But yeah, I tried, and that's why I like so much, bubblegum and power pop and stuff like that, because I tried to purposely not be, because my brother could definitely be sort of snotty about stuff like that. And I said, I'm no, if I like it, I like it. And I hate Jimmy Buffett because I hate his music. But if I liked Cheeseburger in Paris, I would admit it. I happen to hate it, but I have no problem with liking other stuff. So, all right. So
Understood.
after ABBA,
The Doors, and certainly benefited from a very short run of 5 years or something like that.
we're not including the album after Morrison died.
No, you're talking about when they were a
Circle of
trio.
Light, or
No, Full Circle and
Full Circle. That was it.
and Other Voices.
Yeah.
Which I happen to think they're okay, but I wasn't really considering those.
Okay.
I was considering the Doors when they're really the Doors, which means when Jim Morrison was still alive.
And so you like Soft Parade?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Because that got like blasted by critics when that came
Oh,
out.
sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Which I understand. And I wouldn't say it's a bad album per se, but I certainly don't think it's as good as their other albums. And that's why Morrison Hotel was hailed as such a comeback album for them. And that's a rare thing where a band ends on one of their best, if not their best album.
LA Woman.
Yeah. Yeah. Morrison Hotel. Yeah.
Now LA Woman's the last one.
I thought LA Woman was on Morrison Hotel.
No, no. LA Woman is the record with Riders on the Storm,
Okay.
Lover Madly.
Okay. Yeah,
And
which came out
that
right
was,
after. Yeah.
yeah,
And
that was the last Doors record with Morrison,
which
all recorded live.
I love all those songs except for Riders on the Storm, which I cannot stand. That to me is cocktail music.
Yeah, yeah, interesting.
I don't like some of his other stuff, like stuff off Soft Parade that he got mocked for. I don't mind nearly as much as Riders on the Storm. So, but I do like the earliest. I like When the Music's Over very much. I like the end, Moonlight Drive, as we're talking about during a trivia exchange. Soul Kitchen, which then their X covered, and ironically leading to their to Ray Manzarek becoming the Doors. I mean, becoming X's manager. So
Uh, I don't think he was their manager. I think he was just their producer.
he was their manager as far as I know. We'll have to double check that.
Eh,
Yeah,
I
early
think
on.
I gotta disagree with
Okay.
your research
He
there, Norm.
he
You know
definitely
what movie that's from?
no.
I think I got to disagree with your calculations, Norm. Fargo, when
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay.
there's, yeah, I
Yeah.
won't go into it, but
The-
I thought you might pick up
I
on it.
I needed the accent. So
Yes,
but yeah, so I guess he produced the first two albums.
at least, and maybe the
I
third
don't
and fourth, but
I don't think so. Definitely not the fourth, because the fourth is overproduced. That is 8.5 grand, if I recall.
that's the fifth.
That's the fifth. Okay, so the
Yeah.
first one's just X
Um, Los
or Los
Angeles,
Angeles. Okay,
Wild Gift,
well,
Under
gift
the Big Black
back to
Sun,
Sun. Yep.
More Fun in the New World.
Right.
Those are the
Okay.
first four.
Right. Okay.
I
And
I like all those records a
yeah,
lot
not
too. I'm
me,
a big X
me
fan.
too. And I like their spinoff, the Knitters. Their
That's the
country
country
version.
thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I saw
Never really
them.
heard them.
Saw the Knitters. Saw X with Dave Allen when he was with them briefly. Saw John Doe solo. No, I was a big X fan. So
Um, Speaking of, they got back together, all the originals, and put
yep.
out a record about 2 years ago, which of course I picked up.
Yep.
And it sounds like classic X. It sounds just like those first handful of records. It's not as good. The songs aren't as good,
Right.
but if you haven't heard it, you should check it out. Being such a big X fan.
Yeah, which I will do, which is surprising. My sister actually saw them last year or the year before, I think last year. And the funniest thing was she sent me pictures. Billy Zoom was sitting on a chair playing guitar on stage. And like, that's not the Billy Zoom I remember. And so age gets us all, I guess, but it's just pretty funny to see that. So,
I'm
and
sure he still had his big grin with his wide stance.
yes, but you can only wide stand so much when sitting on a chair. And it's funny, he used to also take pictures of the audience all the time, because I remember him doing that at several shows I went to, and interesting hobby. And unfortunately, as far as Exene goes, she's now become a right-wing conspiracy nutball. But um, but
Says who?
I years ago, Kim and I were at a concert where she was spouting off stuff and all. This is like you can check this out. Like just look up, Exene, comma right wing, theories, and you'll see a ton of stuff on it.
Huh.
So,
Huh. That's too bad.
yeah, which is just surprising. Her, like that band of all people, So
Yeah, I had heard that one of the reasons Billy Zoom left when he did is because he was the right winger in the band, and it was causing friction with the rest of the band. So we're talking back during whenever he left. It was probably still during the Reagan presidency,
right.
um, late 80s or something. But I could never imagine Exene
Yeah,
going down that route.
and that's why it was particularly disturbing. Yeah, and at least John Doe is still stayed true to himself. But yeah, like I said, their music really good, great live band, really really good. But I remember the first time I heard Los Angeles and Johnny Hit and Run Pauline, I was like, oh my god, this music is for me.
Um, Next on my list, Paul Weller. We'd already touched on the Jam, but Paul
Yep.
Weller has put out a shitload of solo records, starting with the self-titled record that came out in I think 91. And since then, for the last 30 some years now, he's consistently put out great rock record after great rock record, and
You
I
turned me
know
on
them
to the
all.
first three. You turned me on to the first three, and which I thought each one was just really, really good. I remember with Bitterness Rising and Bull Rush. I remember several of the songs. As opposed to the albums themselves, I remember various cuts from them, but I really like them. Really well done albums.
Yeah, and the quality rarely wavers.
Mhm.
Like up until just the last few records he's put out, 30 years later, they're all really strong, just like those first three that you're familiar with. And the feel and sound of the records doesn't vary a lot. They're just solid rock records. Some of them have more of a traffic influence, which that actually started with his first couple solo records, but
Yep.
you see that appear now and then, and bands like Traffic of that era that were obviously a huge influence on him. The Small Faces being another band from that era that has always been a huge influence on him, and that sound shows up in a lot of his solo work, and I
But it's
couldn't
interesting.
recommend those records enough.
But it's interesting because like the Small Faces and the Who were big influences on the Jam, on the first, couple of Jam albums without question. But Traffic is such a different band than the Small Faces or the Who,
Mm.
and you see the difference in his solo album. And then something like Style Council, the other, sort of side project band he was in. Which is also, very sort of jazz band, which I know you're not a big fan of. I like them.
Yeah, I've never really cared for them that much. I have a couple of their records that I picked up for cheap, and I'm more receptive to them certainly now than back when they first started putting out when they first were a band right after the breakup of the Jam. I think myself, like so many people, were like when the Jam broke up and he started Style Council, people, including myself, were like, "What the fuck is this?"
Right, which I get. But I'm sure there are people when Paul Westerberg went solo after the replacements broke up who had that attitude about his, his stuff. And again, and I get that. I just, like I said, I tried not to let myself fall prey to that sort of, thing. So
It's so much tougher to do when you're a youngster and you think you know everything, as when you're an oldster
yes,
and you actually do know a little more,
yeah,
and you're way more open-minded. And when it comes to things like that, music, things that we would just outright dismiss back in the day, I'm finding I'm discovering some things that I like more than anything else these days that I used to dismiss,
right.
if that makes sense.
Sure. And I think one of the things that's interesting is when, like, starting back with the Beatles and the Stones, how they went from, pop or blues to country to psychedelic to, going, through these various different genres. And you cannot like one, and that's okay, because then there'll be, other stuff for you down the road. So,
Um, still working on this list here.
yep, please
You let me
continue.
know if you get tired of my list.
Nope, continue. You're
I
on.
I have a few more that are bands that I think you're pretty familiar with their catalog, and
Okay.
then I have a category of stuff that firmly falls into what we're talking about, but it's stuff that I don't think you're super familiar with.
Okay.
Um, and
So
I have a lot,
let's
and
keep
they're
going with the ones I'm familiar with. It'll
sure,
be more
sure.
interesting back and forth.
Um, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds.
Okay. And I
Not a bad record.
don't know Nick Cave's music well enough as I should, because everything I've listened to, I have liked. So if you were going to recommend one Nick Cave album in particular,
Oh, like a place to start?
yes.
Probably. Boy, there's about three.
Okay.
It'd be tough for me to narrow it
No,
down
no.
to
So
one.
three's good. So name the three.
Okay. No More Shall We Part, which was a double. It came out in 2001, I believe. Uh, the Boatman's Call, which
I
is a
know that
single
one.
record,
Yeah.
that's one of his, he doesn't, hard to say he has popular records, but that's one of his more popular records, I guess.
Yeah.
Came out, I think, in '98. And something a little later, which I think is just as strong, maybe his strongest record, or certainly close to it. One that came out around 2013 called Push the Sky Away. You could not go wrong checking out those records, or really just throw a dart at his catalog on the wall and it's going to be a good record. They're stylistically different depending on the era, much rougher, darker sounding, the first decade of his
And
career.
and that's the stuff I know more. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like people of our age, if you know any Nick Cave, it's usually the earlier stuff that he was putting out in the late 80s and the 90s, um, when he was a junkie.
The good old
Um,
days.
so yeah, he's long cleaned up. I think he cleaned up in the 90s, I think, late 90s. There's just a little sidebar. I had mentioned that book that Mark Lanigan wrote,
Yep.
that autobiography that came out a couple of years ago. Anyway, there's a section in it that has Nick Cave in it. The Screaming Trees, or maybe it was just Lanigan by himself, was playing Lollapalooza the same year that Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds were playing Lollapalooza. So I think this was the second, third, fourth year Lollapalooza, so early 90s. And there's this anecdote in that book where Mark Lanigan is talking about how much of a rabid junkie Nick Cave is. And that's, a great example of the pot calling the kettle black.
Yes.
But it's just that book is chock full of anecdotes like that, and he's just talking about it matter of factly. He's not talking about it to talk poorly of Nick Cave.
Sure.
He's just representing his life and everything he went through and remembering it all. But anyway, thank God Nick Cave cleaned up his act, because ever since he did, he started putting out just amazing record after amazing record. Next one on the list is Radiohead.
Yep, I was going to list Radiohead, and I agree with that. I prefer their earlier albums. I know Kim and my brother, like Kim in particular, like their later albums. So she's a big like Tree of Limbs fan. Whereas for me personally, their best album is The Bends. That's the one that I really love. But I agree that they have not put out a bad record.
It was minor correction. It was King of Limbs.
King of Limbs. That's what it was. Okay.
And I firmly fall in the Kim camp.
Yep. I think most Radiohead fans do.
I as much as I like the Bends and the one before it, their first record, Pablo Honey,
yep,
by far my least favorite. And the Bends being my second least favorite.
And it's hard to believe they even released Pablo Honey. Like it's hard to believe they're the same band.
Yeah.
When you listen to King of Limbs or or any of their later stuff.
They progress so rapidly in the realm of rock music.
I mean, it's again, like if I put on Pablo Honey and you were a Radiohead fan and you didn't know the album, you would say, "Who's this?"
And fortunately for them, it had their one hit single.
Yep.
Or not their one, but I guess that was
pretty much
probably their biggest hit single.
By far their biggest hit, hands down.
Put them on the map because it had mainstream success.
Yep. And that song, for the unknown out there, is Creep. So, but yeah, and that song got a lot of radio play.
And it was all over MTV during those years too, which to have a big mainstream hit, you had to be on MTV at that point.
Right.
And then another one. So not all of these artists are necessarily straight up rock artists. So this being a perfect example, Bob Marley, during his, if you include his official albums, there's no bad ones.
It's funny. And this is Bob Marley's just gotten too much airplay, too much. I just he's one of the few artists where I have a backlash against, even though I don't think his music's bad. Don't get me wrong, but it's why I prefer other art. I like Jimmy Cliff, Peter Tosh. I just prefer other reggae artists. It's just too much of, you were talking about how they hold up Shane McGowan as as much higher than in our minds. That's how I feel about Bob Marley. And now they've got a movie coming out, and it's only going to get worse, in terms of, he's God, and it's just, again, I don't, I know his music, I certainly know his greatest hits. But it's just, it's hard for me to step back and listen to him fairly. If you're gonna recommend one album of his, what would that be? Because again, I think most people just know his greatest hits.
Yeah. I would probably, as a starting point, probably go with Catch a Fire.
Okay.
And I think that's from 73. And it was really the record that put them on the map, Bob Marley and the Wailers on the map in this country. Yeah, that would be the one I would pick. But you couldn't, in my opinion, you couldn't go wrong with any of them. I love Peter Tosh and I love Jimmy Cliff. I have a lot of records by both of those guys and a lot of Bob Marley records. I think they are all of the same caliber. And I understand there's that it's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to Bob Marley and how he's in your face, so to speak. Is that what you're getting at?
Yep,
kind of.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay. And so it's just like, yeah, I get it. He's good, but like, enough. Let me hear something else. And that's not really fair. I did see Peter Tosh live at the Orpheum in Boston years ago, obviously, and a comedian opened, which was the strangest thing to do in the world to me, to have the comedian open. And like, there are people in the audience, and I'm serious about this, they have bongs. They don't have joints, they have bongs in the audience. Okay. And so everyone is stoned. Even if you weren't smoking, you were stoned because you couldn't not be. And the comedian's terrible, and people are like booing him. And the guy freaks out and starts yelling at the audience, "You guys suck. You don't know good comedy. You don't know anything. You're just stoneheads." And like, the guy's like, basically have to drag him off the stage. And everyone in the audience is stoned, going, "Wait, did that just happen, man? Like, what was that?" It was very strange. I'll never forget that. But Peter Tosh was quite good. I was really hoping Mick was going to come out and do "Walk and Don't Look Back" with him, because they'd just done it together on Saturday Night Live. But alas,
so that was a long time ago.
Yeah,
yeah. What were you, like 12?
17, 16, 17. I don't remember what year it was. But I didn't even know that was a Temptations cover. And so I found that out later on. So, but that was his pretty much one hit. So.
Okay. These are, are we done? No, we're not done yet.
No, I think we have a little bit of time. And by the way, everyone, we don't know when we're going to run out of time. So here goes.
It runs out when it runs out. Then we just pick up where we left off.
Yep.
These are these bands firmly fall into this category. Most of them are, or actually all of them, are more contemporary. So I'm just going to go down the list: Stereolab, Clinic, Broadcast, Tindersticks, PJ Harvey, Elbow, Kevin Morby, Juana Molina, and Air.
So as far as
and Mark Lanigan, but we've already talked about him ad nauseum.
Tindersticks, Kim was a big fan of the Tindersticks, and so she used to play them a fair amount. I couldn't tell you what album was what, or even what song was what, but I liked what I heard. Are they Australian?
No, they're English.
Okay. But so I like them. And then Clinic, because there was a time when I like they were playing around the same club, same time as Firewater. So I saw Clinic a couple times.
Really?
And I gotta say, live, I don't know their albums. I really don't. But live,